LPS Customs. Except this one's really old and not the focus of the video. Sorry, Azrael. For those of you who are new around here, I used to do LPS Customs between 2016 and 2020. But sometime mid-2020, I pivoted away from art toys to illustration. But with my return to the LPS hobby last year, I started doing a few customs again. In 2024, I only managed to complete 4 of them, though I did start a few, just got caught up with other things and didn't end up finishing them. 2 of them were on old bases that I had laying around and finally found a use for them, and 2 of them are on G7 bases. So without further ado, let's get into it. The first one is Collie 1676, but bunny. My first custom after 4 years of not doing it, and like I said earlier, this is a recreation of Collie 1676 on a rabbit base. For some context, that is actually one of my dreamy collies, but I think the main problem here was using the wrong paint. For context, I was gifted a box set of Arteza outdoor paints and wanted to use that on a custom since I didn't know if my old paints at the time were still good. In hindsight, this was a bad idea. I hope my camera is able to pick this up, but something that is pretty obvious in real life is how globby the paint is compared to like some of the other customs I've done in the past. And I feel like this one is user error since these paints were made for larger surfaces like wood panels and outdoor pottery. So it's pretty thick compared to more conventional paints used for figurines like apple barrels and model paints. Those tend to be thinner and usually get into smaller crevices like the paws over here without completely globbing over them. That in combination with not being used to making customs anymore and rushing in some areas led to this not being my best. Also, there's something about this custom that feels tacky and kinda gross to touch. Like, if it was a painting, I wouldn't have an issue with it, since you're not supposed to touch those that much anyways, but for a custom I intend to handle, yeah, it's kinda gross feeling. Overall, I like the concept of making a main 5 a non-main 5 and think it would be really cool to revisit in the future, but for this custom, not my favorite, just because of the issues I had. I might see about deconstructing and using this base for something later on down the line. Not sure what yet since I don't have any ideas that use this specific base, but I know I can do much better than this. The second one is this Otter. This was a double I got, and I figured it would be good to make a custom out of this one and avenge the last custom I made. And I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. I based it off like 2 random paint swatches I picked up at the hardware store on the custom itself. First difference is I used the right paints. I replaced some of my older dried out apple barrels with newer ones, and it turned out only 3 of them needed a replacement. Yeah. The second is being more patient with this one, which while I don't think it's nearly as big of a factor to being globby as using the wrong paint, I did think it kept it flatter and neater since I wasn't rushing through each coat. The third is I wanted to do some style experiments. The main thing is bringing in some elements from my main illustration style into my customs, which was something I was starting to do around the time I dipped out, but I didn't go too far with it, so I'm glad I managed to try it here. The main thing I wanted to do was add some line art-esque elements to some of the corners and crevices, but I also kept the eyes pretty simple and flat since I tend to do that in my own art. Not sure if I'll do all of my customs eyes like this going forward because painting more detailed ones is still really fun, but I think for the flatter cartoony look I was going for, it fits. The next one is a partial custom. My first one actually. Also a G7 double I got. The main reason I went with a partial here versus a full-on custom is I found this specific Corgi mold, the head sits very close to the neck, and I didn't want to risk having paint that's a little too easy to scratch off or accidentally get rid of the bauble in the painting process. I'll bring in the original version of the Corgi for comparison. I went with a LPS eye style for this design and kept it pretty simple. The main difference is I changed the face marking from a diamond shape to a teardrop blobby thingy. I also added eyebrows, some white freckles, and I painted the paw pads. It's a pretty simple custom, but I think it was a nice short project that forced me to think differently than how I'd normally do a full repaint. Because in a way, it's technically easier and much faster than if I did a full paint over, but since I'm building over the factory paint rather than completely replacing it, it's kind of a lot less forgiving if you do mess up. Interesting to think about, you know? The final one is not an LPS custom. It's actually a My Little Pony custom of, drumroll please, my mascot. This one was done on a MLP G4.5 base I had laying around for about 5 years. I do have a few other MLP bases in storage, but I chose this one since I wanted to base it off how I tend to draw Zinnia as opposed to how she'd look as a My Little Pony character. I brought in some of the line art-esque elements that I used on the Otter custom, though I also changed some of the colors in the quote-unquote line art to appear more like shading. Also, I'm not sure what it is, but she's kind of giving pop music character vibes, if that makes sense. I think it's how I did the eyes, to be honest. The tail ended up being a bit bigger than I expected it to be, though to be fair, I tend to draw her tail a lot more exaggerated anyways, and it sort of acts as a counterweight to all the sculpting I did on her head. I did leave out the deco bit off her design since I don't really draw it often. Really, I only have this in here so there isn't a weird hole in her ear. This was also my first time sculpting in years. I actually used this as a quote-unquote simpler sculpting project before I jump into some more complex customs I want to do, and yeah, this took way too long. Part of it is self-inflicted because I wanted to keep a more angular style, so I spent a lot of time on sanding, plus I wanted to redo the muzzle to be closed, and that was a ton of extra work on its own. And while I was doing this, I was trying to relearn how epoxy sculpt works. Like, I need to readjust to the curing times, what's the best time to shape, smooth it onto the base, carve, and so on. I still might need some work on that, but honestly, for jumping in after not using it for so long, I think she turned out alright. But part of the reason why she took forever to make is I ran into some motivation issues last year. Maybe it was the sheer amount of sanding and mini tweaks I was doing along the way, but what ended up happening a lot in the process was I'll do some work, and then she'd sit unfinished on my desk for weeks until I pick up the project again. Like, I think I started her in July, but didn't end up finishing her until October. It's far from the first time I've had this happen to me, but it's definitely something I want to try to work on if I want to see other projects like this through to the end. Especially since some of the customs I plan on making after this one, those include a lot of sculpting, but you know, I think the fact that I managed to complete this is proof that I'm able to finish and get a more involved custom out of the whip pile. And I've completed more complex customs before. I just gotta figure out how to keep up the steam while I'm deep in the project. But overall, I'm very happy that I made this custom. I think it's fun to have as kind of a different version of my mascot. By the way, her head still turns somewhat, just not as much due to how the neck peg sat after I reattached it. Not sure where else to mention it, but yeah, it's there. She can move her head somewhat. So yeah, these are my 4 customs of 2024. I do want to continue making customs after this, but I guess that depends on if I can keep up the motivation for it. In terms of needing a break from illustration, I think it was pretty nice. I've actually been in and out of a creative burnout for drawing the past year or so having creative projects available to me that's not directly drawing related is good for breaking out of my normal workflow. Anyways, I have my LPS related socials in the description, but keep in mind I'm only semi-active in the community these days, so it's best to turn on post notifs if you want to keep up with me. But this is Nat, and now I gotta get the motivation to work through my custom backlog. Ooh. Yep, my customs backlog.